Good afternoon, everyone. If you happen to be watching this live, thank you for tuning in to our postponed event. I was a little under the weather last month when this was originally scheduled to take place. And if you are watching live, you also know that white smoke emerged from the Sistine Chapel about an hour ago. Good afternoon, everyone. We'll be waiting to see if you happen to be watching this live. Thank you for tuning in to our postponed event. I was a little under the weather edition of Live Art in Focus. We were in the Bellarmine Hall Galleries at Fairfield University, sitting in front of this case, which I always like to include a sense of scale of our object. So there is our little ivory diptych, very small, very delicate. And there we were in a little semicircle that just by chance happened to include a Jesuit member of the community here at Fairfield University. And he literally got a buzz on his phone to alert him that white smoke had emerged. So he said he would not forget that was his experience of learning that the conclave had come to an end. Our little object seen here, much larger on your screen, is a work by an unknown French artist. It is from the 14th century. There you see the actual dimensions of it when it is opened. And it is on generous loan to the Fairfield University Art Museum from the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Those of you who have watched an Art in Focus know that you are more than welcome to put any observations or responses, reactions in the chat. If you're not watching live, you can always email museum@fairfield.edu if you have questions or ideas or just something that you would like to share after the fact. One of the things that surprised me as we looked at this object together, as I looked at it before preparing for Art in Focus, I noticed more about it every time I take a closer look at it. And because of its small size, and also because of the fact that, I'll go back to the case for a second, we can't remove it from this case because all of the objects within it are on loan to us from the Metropolitan. So part of the rules of that deal, if this case ever needed to be opened, a curator from the Met would travel here to just be present and take care of their artifacts while it was open. So a member of the museum team had asked me this morning, she's like, "Oh, are you gonna take that out?" I'm like, "No, we would love to, but we can't." So that means this is a case where high resolution images are of such extraordinary help, even though I, as an art historian, am always encouraging my students, our museum visitors, to try to get as much of a sense of the material reality of an object as we possibly can. There are times when it is just very challenging. So it's in the case on a little stand. If you push yourself around the case to the side, you can get a little bit of a sense of the back of the object, which I will show you. It is not carved, but if you're trying to imagine the tactile relationship to something, it gets that little bit more difficult when it is locked away from you in a case. But it is wonderful that the Metropolitan Museum of Art makes so many high resolution images available, not only for digital consultation on their website, but also for download. And that is the case here. Here is an incredible photograph now of this diptych, which just means an object that is in two pieces. We can see its hinges still intact after all this time. It also has a little chain that is meant to keep it latched when it's closed. But here it is fully open, and there is just an extraordinary wealth of detail carved into the surface of this ivory object. If you are familiar with the traditions of Christian imagery, your mind is probably already immediately categorizing certain scenes that are the most recognizable. Perhaps, for example, at the upper left, we see Jesus on the cross. You connect that to the crucifixion. You might see directly below it, there is the infant Jesus being nursed by his mother Mary. There are some scenes that took a little bit of discussion in the group. I mean, I cheated in the sense of I prepared in advance. But we spent some time looking both at the object in the case and passing around my iPad Pro to see if we could identify all of the scenes and see if we could discern in what order they've been placed. Because even though this mimics the appearance of a book and is very much intended to be handled like a small book held in the hands, the unknown carver did not begin this narration at the upper left. Rather, we find ourselves at the lower left. So we're thinking of this in two rows as opposed to just the two pages. And the whole bottom register is what is intended for us to be read first. Starting at the extreme lower left with the Annunciation to the Virgin Mary, the infancy, the birth of Christ. We have on the moving to the right-hand page, we can see what looks like a miniature sun emerging from the Gothic arch above, and that is the three kings, the wise men visiting the newborn child. The image at the right is the one that we discussed because it might not immediately call to mind any Christian iconography, unless you're really thinking about, okay, what comes next? What comes next? Is we have the Virgin Mary holding the infant child in front of another man, and with what appears to be maybe a table around them, and then the sort of sacred lamp hanging from above. So this is the scene of the presentation of Christ in the temple and likely the circumcision. And from there, we go all the way across this object now to the upper left. So the bottom register takes us through both the Annunciation to Mary and then the infancy of Christ, and then we have jumped ahead in time. We have skipped over 30 years of his ministry, and we have jumped right to the flagellation. So there's Jesus. He is attached to the column. We have the two torturers who have flails in their hand. Then next to it, the crucifixion itself, the resurrection, Jesus climbing out of the tomb. And then finally, we see a scene of the Virgin Mary ascended into heaven and crowned alongside her son. So there is a huge amount of Christian imagery contained in this relatively tiny object. One thing there's not is any remnant of paint. So there's no evidence that this was ever polychromed with different colors applied to it or any gold, although that was pretty common among other examples of carved ivory books like this one. So the Met has something like 30 of these carved ivory objects, some of which have color, some of which don't. And one of the ways in which it's fascinating when a museum is able to assemble a collection of many examples of a type of object is that it helps us understand how relatively common something might have been. So on the one hand, we're looking at an object of extraordinary luxury. We are looking at a piece of an elephant's tusk that has been split down the middle and so delicately carved to produce these extraordinary scenes and then joined together with the hinges. If we're talking about France in the 14th century, this would of course have belonged to someone who was of a very high socioeconomic status. And unlike in the cases where we refer to Christian visual imagery as having been a kind of Bible of the unlettered, we can probably guess that the person who owned this may very well have been literate, might also have owned, for example, a book of hours to guide their prayer. But this too would have been one of many examples of a devotional object that they would hold in their hands for personal guided meditation as they focus on each one of these scenes. But as I said, the fact that there are many examples of them, 30 just at the Metropolitan, of course, in other museums around the world, this was the product of a sort of a luxury market operating in the Middle Ages in Paris, where there were so many different shops making different luxury items out of ivory, everything from dice to rosary beads to devotional diptychs like this one, that they sort of had little mini guilds of specialization. So while this is an extraordinary object and an exceptional one, it's also not unique. It's not a one-off by any means. And there are a remarkable, there's sort of a stylistic continuity that can be detected among many of these objects, where we don't have the names of any carvers, we don't have the names of any workshops. But for example, one thing that's been pointed out is that they tend to frame their scenes in these delicate Gothic arches and traceries with the hints of all of the sort of architectural ornament that we might associate with the High Middle Ages and Paris. And in some of the ways that the figures are depicted, nope, not the one I meant. There we go. The ways that the figures are depicted, the Virgin Mary here seen in very close-up scene of the Annunciation with what appears to be less a dove of the Holy Spirit and more like a bird of prey coming down out of the sky. You might be able to detect this sort of sinuous S curve, this very elegant pose in which the Virgin Mary is standing, which if you've taken art history, you may very well associate with that sort of Gothic elegance. I'm going to go back to the scene of the upper left, which I placed in there because this is always the compartment, I'll say, the scene to which I direct the attention of students, let's say, if there's a class that's coming in, maybe a religious studies class that's thinking about how Christians practice their religion in times past. But I focus in on this one because I think it allows someone to get a little bit of a better sense of the extraordinary amount of skill and craftsmanship and perfectionism that had to have been in play for anyone working in those ivory workshops in the 14th century in Paris. Because here we have Jesus, the Christ at the column. That column is just effectively a toothpick of ivory that has been fully carved out around it in the round. So where we leave Jesus's head to where it connects to the apex of that Gothic arch, there's nothing behind that. There is nothing but air. And you can also see that behind the traceries has been carved out, behind the legs of the torturers have been carved out, because we can see the shadow that is cast on them. So this incredible sense of three-dimensionality in a craft that, much like carving in stone, if the ivory carver's chisel slips and they take out that column, there's no going back. The whole piece of ivory has been wasted. So it's an incredible commitment on the one hand to making this as naturalistic as possible, both in terms of physical form, but also in terms of giving us some measure of three-dimensional space. And you can also make out that they have gone to the extent of incising lines that look like the irregular pattern of bricks or stones to give you the sense that this is a wall that Jesus has in behind him. So just really extraordinary levels of detail, which are challenging to see in person in the museum without being able to interact with this object like its makers intended. We are grateful to the mediation of high resolution imagery to help us see a little more. And why I'm also intrigued by where this series ends, that it ends with the enthroning of the Virgin Mary receiving a crown from an angel at the upper right, joining her son after the Dormition. And something that was shared in our group that we were in the gallery. Let's see what picture I have next. Nope, I'm gonna have to go back. The Jesuit who's with us in the gallery pointed out that there is an organization here that might not be the immediate one. On the one hand, we realized that we are intended here to read along the bottom register, return to the top left and read along the top, and then we end with the crowning of the Virgin Mary. That doesn't really follow any of the ways we read words besides the part where we go right to left. We definitely don't go bottom to top. And it should be said that there is no set pattern for all of these surviving carved ivory objects. It's not that it's always done in this manner. But in this particular case, he pointed out that there is effectively sort of an X-shaped pattern, a chironic pattern, to use the word for the Greek, the key, the Greek letter for the X, because Father Garrett, the Jesuit who's with us in the gallery, pointed out that we start at the lower left with the Annunciation to Mary, we end with Mary enthroned as Queen of Heaven. And on the other axis, he pointed out the circumcision opposite the flagellation. We have the first drops of blood shed by Christ on earth, and then you have the scene of his torture, which will ultimately be part of the passion and death. So he saw in that a very clear matching, a sort of metaphorical cross being created by the opposition of the scenes that occur in those corners. I certainly hadn't put that together. So I joked to the groups, like, this is why you invite a Jesuit, to come along when you're discussing objects like this, so they can add that extra layer of their own knowledge. But it is fascinating and could add to the kind of deep meditation that could be encouraged for the original owner of this object. Obviously, you could focus on any of these individual scenes, but thinking about how they relate to each other would be intended to only deepen the owner's communion with God. And I want to make mention too that another of our visitors, Pat, who was with us in the gallery, she said that she was actually delighted that Art in Focus was pushed forward a month, because she noted how appropriate it felt to be looking at this object together, one that seems to celebrate the Virgin Mary as a mother when it's taking place so close to Mother's Day. And I responded to Pat that, in fact, one of the things we know about this time, Christianity in this time period in Europe, especially in Paris, the devotion to the Virgin Mary is growing very strong. So that scene ending with the crowning of the Virgin Mary on this sort of 14th century Gothic object, it fits perfectly with what we understand how Christians were looking at their religion and at the role of Mary as the mediator and intercessor within that religion. So super fun when things like that tie together. The world around us and how we look at an object like this and what it might have meant to the people who originally owned it. I'll go back to this. Again, more incredible images that are from the Metropolitan's website. This is a view that's really challenging to have in the museum. As I mentioned, if you kind of frame your head around the side of the case, you'll be able to see the back of the diptych, which we're seeing open from the back on the left. You can see the latch on either side, the little nails where the hinges have been adhered. You get a sense of it being slightly battered, slightly worn, not quite white, but a sort of creamier color. And I love this image on the right that is the diptych closed. One of the people who's with us in the gallery remembered being gifted a sort of replica of an object like this made of wood, and pointing out that it's just very durable, it's very portable. And it reminds us what these things are for. They are small, they're made from a durable material, and you can take it with you whenever you go. But it also, from this view along the bottom, it sort of looks like the growth rings of a tree, except we know this is not carved from wood, but rather from elephant ivory, which is another great reminder of the world that this object comes from. Paris has an incredible network of trade relationships, not only with the Arab world, but also with North Africa. And they are getting elephant ivory to produce these extraordinary, not just the diptychs like this one, but I mentioned things like dice or rosary beads. So that is all part of this big wider net of commerce and interaction that is just fascinating. And we don't have no idea the size of the tusk that of the elephant that this was taken from, but bearing in mind this thing is very small, it's very slender. Who knows how many objects could each tusk could produce if this is sort of sliced off the center of one. And the last thing I'll note that we pointed out talking about in the gallery, even though we are not so fortunate as to be able to hold this object as was intended, one of the interesting things about ivory is that it warms up quite quickly and holds body heat. She says, reporting what she has read at secondhand, because I have never been so fortunate as to be holding any elephant ivory, but in a different way, for example, than if this was carved of stone. First of all, it would probably be a lot heavier. Stone, it has a harder time retaining heat. Ivory, made of the same stuff as the teeth that are in your mouth. It holds on to heat very nicely. What a pleasurable feeling that would have been to hold this very smooth exterior case in your hands, have it not be cold and foreign as you are spending probably a considerable amount of time meditating and praying using the visual images that are contained within it. And as a last note, I'll note that this was given to the Metropolitan by J.P. Morgan, a name that many of you are familiar with. But it sort of struck me as a little this morning when I was looking at this, because it's a gift of J.P. Morgan, 1917, but J.P. Morgan had died in 1913. But I think the movement of his collection, much of which he himself had donated to the Metropolitan, more that was given by his son, J.P. Morgan Jr., after his death. Presumably, there was some sort of slower legal process for it to actually become the part of the Metropolitan's collection, but J.P. Morgan himself had died in 1913 in Rome. That said, if you are in New York and you can visit the Morgan Library and you have not done so, as I discovered that one of our attendees had a relative living a couple blocks away and had never entered, make that part of your next trip to New York. The Morgan Library is just absolutely incomparable. This is our last Art in Focus for the spring of 2025. The series will begin again in the fall, so we hope to see you either in person at the Fairfield University Art Museum or once again on Zoom and on YouTube. And hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.